So Landfall Data is an amazing company. I've learned a little bit about them recently, and you guys are going to love this. So Jason, I'll take it away.
All right, great, thank you. I was scared of large public speaking, and I think I've accomplished getting past that one today. But thank you guys for showing up. I think those of you here will get some enjoyment and hopefully learn a couple things. Today I'm here really to talk about something that I think is affecting all of us, and that is our inability to deliver phone calls any longer. I'm sure you all look at your phone today and you probably got 5, 7 spam calls, right? You're not alone. And hopefully the outcome of what we're trying to accomplish today is help everybody here, first of all, understand why that's happening, because it's really preventing profitable telemarketing across the industry. So to give you a good understanding of what's actually causing this right now, because there are solutions to get around it, get a better framework as to what the government is doing, and the solutions they put in place that actually are causing this, and then most importantly, hopefully, give you enough education to understand what are the behaviors and what are the new rules of the road that you need to follow to actually be able to deliver phone calls. I will tell you that at the end, you'll see, we have clients now that are delivering and connecting at rate 30 plus, whereas most call centers are sitting around 5-7%. And it's nothing magical, it's some cool technology, but it really first starts with understanding the right behaviors that you have to follow in order to be able to deliver to your current customer base and keep telemarketing a profitable channel. So the first thing is, what's actually causing the increased call blocking and spam tagging? And there seems to be a lot of confusion between TCPA and what people think the law is, which has nothing to do with what I'm about to talk to you about. TCPA has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on, but it seems people think like, oh, if I have TCPA leads and consent, my calls will go through. No, that's just table stakes. Compliance is just now table stakes to not get sued. What's really going on right now is a few bad actors placed a ton of phone calls to people over the last couple of years and scammed a lot of money. I won't read the slide so you can read the statistics, but what's interesting is if you blew up that top 50 robocallers, the red boxes are only about 7 of them. 7 out of the top 50 are the ones that are causing these problems. Because companies like AT&T, T-Mobile, Target, they all use this type of technology to engage with their customers. However, because of the noise it's caused, the government legislated something called the Trace Act. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Trace Act, and I won't bore you with the government's Trace Act, but the short version is Congress authorized the FCC and the carriers to take steps to identify people that were using robocall technology. That was the one thing they wanted to stop. And call spoofing, or what's often using phone numbers that don't belong to you for the purpose of trying to connect. That's what the government was trying to do. And as the government often does, its solutions don't always have the intended consequences, unfortunately. The first piece, we call it the first weapon of mass destruction. Have you guys heard of stir shaking before? Because it's one of the most misunderstood things that are out there right now in terms of what it actually means. First of all, stir shaken, all it is a requirement by the FCC that the carriers have to be able to pass a certificate that attests from the originating carrier to the terminating carrier two things. This is the company that they say they are, that's one. And two, this is the phone number they're authorized to use. That's all it is. And it breaks down to an attestation score of an A, B, or C. But guess what? It's not even in place right now. Only a fraction of the calls being made are actually stir, shake, and delivered. And the reason is, a lot of traffic goes over what they call TDM switching networks. Those are the old phone lines. And until those carriers are able to pass the certificates, stir shaking really isn't kicked in. However, the FCC pushed the deadline for those carriers from July of 2023 up to June of 2022. So come June of 2022, pretty much all the traffic that's passing over the phone carrier lines now will have that attestation score. However, as you see in a slide or two, it's really not going to make that big of a difference for your calls being delivered. Because there's a second weapon of mass destruction that we call it. And we call it the iron triangle. Not many folks know this, But there are three primary companies that work for the phone carriers. There's Haya, First Orion, and TNS. And they exist solely for the purpose of monitoring the networks for the various carriers and determining and flagging which calls are coming from a robodialer, which calls appear to be illegal calls versus which calls do not. However, they can't distinguish legitimate calls from illegitimate calls. And regardless of what you do, whether you have a good attestation score or not, if your practices aren't correct, your calls won't be delivered. And that's where most people fall down. So briefly, the slide talks about what spam is really defined as. And I pulled from Verizon because it's a great definition. It's unwanted phone calls, which is basically all telemarketing, right? That the carriers look at spam not as like you have TCPA consent. They look at it as, does somebody want this phone call or not? And if it looks like they don't want it delivered, or they want to at least alert the consumer, it's something that they may not necessarily want. That's how the carriers are implementing this. And that's how the Iron Triangle implements this. And they use really complex machine learning algorithms, which is a very complicated topic for people. So I figured out, I explained it like I did to my 15-year-old daughter, who, God, I would never want to grow up like this, but remember the days when you could actually like go to a library when they existed and like write a paper and you might copy something and not cite it? Well, we can do that all day long. Now, when they do that, they have this really advanced algorithms that flag them for plagiarism. You're not going to trick machine learning when you plagiarize. So if they can figure out when you're moving words around that you took that from another author, I guarantee you they can figure out when a call's originating from a dialer, telemarketing, or something that follows a normal pattern of practices. So what people really need to understand and adopt is the pattern of a dialer flags the call as spam. And in fact, there's a picture to the right where you see it says potential spam, and it's got a check mark on it, which means it's verified. And that's a Verizon call. A friend sent that to me. That means that the call actually had an attestation from Stir Shaken. They verified who it was, and they could use the number, and they still pegged it as spam. Why? Because it's off of a dialer, and they're seeing how many times you're calling the person, and about 428 other things that they do to figure out what calls they want and what calls they do not want. Okay, so what now? Because that's like basically what we've learned in terms of telemarketing from day one. I've been doing it since 1991. This is how you telemarket. Well, your strategy really has to start with understanding what the stakeholders involved want, which is why I started where I did. So what is the stakeholders? The audiences that are involved in determining if your call is going to be delivered or not want. Well, the government, they just want you to not make illegal robocalls. They're okay with telemarketing. They want to make sure that you own the number, you're not rotating DIDs, you're not spoofing things. And ultimately, they want you to stop taking money typically from the elderly, but anybody. They just don't want the financial scams. That's really all the government wanted to implement. The mobile operators, they need to comply with the Trace Act. And that is some serious stuff. There's criminal pieces to it. They are required to comply with so many pieces. They've taken an overly cautious approach to it. They've used it as an opportunity not just to comply, but to also protect their customer base as well. Because they don't want their consumers that subscribe to them constantly being barraged by phone calls or spam calls. T-Mobile blocks 100 million calls a day. If you guys telemarket, there's a good chance when you get a spam call, it might be coming from one of your call centers, unless they're following all these practices. And then ultimately, what do we want as brands? We just want the ability to communicate. We want people to know who we are, and we actually want to talk to the right people. We don't want to talk to everybody. You just want to talk to people who actually buy. That's how you get a good, that's how you bring in your cost per acquisition goals. Talking to the right audience, not every audience. And then we want to comply with all the laws, right? And the more complex they seem to be, the more I think we get scared from it, but they're actually pretty simple once you understand the basics. And then lastly, and probably the one that's thought of the least, is what do the consumers really want? Nobody sits around all day and says, man, I can't wait to be called and telemarketed. I mean, I've been in the business since 1991, and I can't stand telemarketing. And I can't stand my phone ringing, so I'm the perfect case. for what probably most consumers are like. But people do want to receive offers that they're interested in. They just want to get them when they're not having dinner, which is kind of contrary to what people usually do. They try to call people at dinner, right? And they don't want to get it while they're at a conference. They want to get it when they can talk. So when you're building a solution, this has to be the foundation of what you put in place, regardless if you follow what we've done or not. These are the things that matter. And again, the iron triangle, the fatal flaw with the government solution, the carriers, it's not designed only to get rid of fraudulent calls. It's designed to get rid of nuanced calls. And they'll tell you, the carriers, telemarketing. They just don't want the predictive, they don't want to see all that type of stuff. So one of the big things I'll tell everybody needs to be concerned about is what I call the red herring solutions, because there's a lot of them going on. If ever I was gonna be in a different business right now, it would be in a dialer business selling DIDs in long distance, because they're making a killing. All that stuff you see, any solution that's predicated upon circumventing good practices is not something that's sustainable. And this happened for anybody that used to be in text messaging. If you knew anything about text messaging, 5 years ago, you could send a message to anybody. Today, you can't almost not get a text message through. Well, the same analytic companies are now digging in on voice. So that's what you're watching happen again. So if you're looking at solutions that claim to be anything with rotating DID numbers or caller ID reputation management, if you need somebody to give you your reputation on your phone numbers, that's a trigger. That means you eventually can get burned, they're gonna need to be replaced, and they just become expensive. And then last but not least, call treatment and branding. There's a lot of companies out there today that claim they can get your calls branded, they can treat them, and they have the magic button to clear your DIDs. Technically, they're called resellers of the iron triangle. That's all they are. Some of them are massive companies that just mark up significantly the same 3 companies' services I just shared with you for free: Haya, First Orion, and TNS. So companies are just focused on that piece of it. They're really just touching on the surface of the problem. They're not at the root of the problem. But as I said, there is a way to do things correctly, at scale, with high conversion rates. So I'll share with you the approach that we've come up with. We call it engagement dialing. So I wish we were smart enough to say that we knew this was gonna happen 4 years ago, but we weren't. This is the most opportunistic thing that's ever happened to us. We set out several years ago, partnered with, you see the name DataScore, that's the data science side of our business, to come up with a process that would help companies better target and identify who to call, but literally who to call, not in general, but based upon their specific companies, and then also how to engage with people at the right time, and not always on fresh new data they have to buy. How do we take millions of dollars worth of leads they've already purchased and they couldn't connect with, and actually help them monetize that, because we saw that as a real opportunity. Never in our wildest dreams did we realize, and then on top of it, we have to help them get dial-up now too, because dialers don't work. So we partnered with also a firm called McMurray & Schuster. They're a fairly large TCPA firm. Michelle Schuster and all, they were involved in the case, the big Facebook case, if you're familiar, where they changed the definition of a dialer. So from the ground up, we worked with her team to develop this approach. She's putting out an opinion letter. We actually combined TCPA compliance along with the regulatory pieces we talked about in delivering what we do. And what we do is very simple to explain, but it's complex behind the scenes, and I'll keep it simple for you guys. So we use data science, real hardcore data science teams and machine learning to build customized models for all of our clients. And we work with a bunch of different companies across verticals. You know, retail, energy, solar, financial services. The solution's ubiquitous, it's vertical agnostic. If you can predict cancer, you could probably predict when someone's gonna pick up the phone, because it's just math and data science, and you just gotta have the right team to do it. And that's what we've developed, is the right team to do it and the right approach to do it. So we'll take in a company's 4 or 5 months of just raw data, with call attempts. And our team will then build a model off of that basically determines the optimal time of day of week, down literally to the second to call somebody. And once that's developed, we'll then take, typically we start with, just give us all your stuff that's garbage. 26 times attempted, you've gotten the dialer disposition in an answering machine or not available, give it to us. That's the stuff we connect the 30% on. Because it's not the data, it's the iron triangle that is the problem. But this process is what also gets a ton of engagement to it. So in real simple terms, the model gives a precision score to every record. Like me, for example, you call me at 9 a.m., right? I'm not gonna pick up, I'm just getting to the office and barely able to have my coffee now. So I might be on the scale of 0 to 1 of 0.2. But Friday at 4:30, I'll probably pick up the phone and talk because I'm winding down and have time. I'm probably at dot A. So what we first do is on the modeling side for calling people, we pick a precision score we want to target, right? And then we look at how long of time period do we want to call these people. If you try to call an audience over a week, your audience size for a dot five above might look like this. If you schedule it over a month, it begins to look like this, right? Because the longer you have to schedule those calls, the more opportunities you can fit people in the slot that they're gonna engage at. And then the second part of it, which is very similar, we look at who buys solar from momentum, which is very different than who buys solar overall. And we build them up because there's a lot of bias involved in marketing, the whole sales process, everything's involved. So when we build our models are built specifically for the companies that we work with, and we take real data that they've sold to and all the people during that period they haven't sold to. And once we build that model, we're able to then pull out of their inventory of data who they should be targeting. And believe it or not, we're able to take penny data that's not on the do not call list and dial it, and it performs just as well as $70 Facebook leads. And I can give you 1,000,001 examples when we've actually matched Facebook leads they purchased when we pulled it out of our penny database once we built the model. Because models don't care if you're on a co-reg path trying to win an iPod, or just on a co-reg path responding to an ad or Facebook or in the mall. They could care less. They look at the attributes of the individual and the other things that data scientists put in this and the machine learning built, and it spits out, this is what a customer looks like. But when you combine the audience that's interested along with the right time to call them, you really see a big lift. And that's how you get the engagement. That's where you don't see the short call durations. That's where you see the conversion rates. And the slide right here, I like to show people versus tell people. So this is actually informed by First Orion. This is actually our portal from First Orion, minus the right side. So I actually pulled this out of the carriers reporting versus our reporting that we have, just so you can see literally from their side versus numbers we can play with. And when you look at the first one's indicative of good behavior. What I'll call out there is, if you do the math between decline rate, which is actually them physically swiping their finger to say no, and connect rate, which is a conversation, our models, and there's 2.9 million calls in this one, so it's a pretty significant audience right there. Over 51% of the time when we made that call, the phone was near the person. And over 50% of the time when it was near them, they picked it up. I'll say that again. Over 50% of the time when we made that phone call, that phone was in their hand, and over half the time they picked it up. That's the combination of knowing when to call somebody and calling the right people, right there. So that, and that's practicing all the good behavior, because these rates I'm showing you right now, with the exception of the far right, are one attempt in a 30-day period. We don't call people multiple times. We call them once. That's why I made the comment about scheduling over a 30-day period of time. That middle one, moderate behavior, that's a client that's manually dialing, that we're treating their calls for them. So when I say treating them, we're actually having them branded. Not the red herring portion of it. We're actually physically treating the calls so they get branded, right? They don't have to rotate the DIDs, they're registered with all the carriers, and they're manually dialing. You can see there's a better contact rate, it's a better connect rate. It's not fantastic. And the far right one, this is actually from our reporting tool. It's a client in the solar verticals, as much I can say, off of their Convoso dialer. So 5.57% connection rate on over 1 million dials. I'll tell you that when we dial for them, we're connecting at 30+%. So hopefully what you guys are taking away from this is, besides we have some interesting technology, you can actually do things really well right now, but you have to change the way you're doing things. If you don't change the way you're doing things, not only will your performance not get better, it'll get worse. All of this dialing all you're doing is setting up red flags all day long. If you stop sending up the flags and start doing things correctly, you'll see a nice incremental lift. Last thing I'll close with you guys on before I ask if you have any questions is, to let you know, these same principles we've applied to digital. Harley Davidson is a great example, which is outside of this. We built a time-based prediction model for people that were servicing their motorcycles to predict with a high level of accuracy when they were ready to purchase a new motorcycle. And it worked incredibly well, so well that we now do digital for them. And we took their CPA from $124, right, down to $23 on their digital advertising. And the difference was, remember I told you that penny data example? Well, we just pulled audiences that matched their model from data we owned and loaded it into the digital platforms and let them, the platforms, start to build their models, not from general characteristics, but from a very precise audience. And the difference when you start with a precise audience and let them build for there is incredibly more powerful than when you're just selecting regions and all that stuff. So,
Thank you, Jason.
thank you guys very much for your time. And,
Thank you, Jason. Before Jason steps down, I just want to ask everybody that's here that is with Landfall Data, please stand up and I'd like to everybody to see who you are. Landfall Data people, we have a big team here from Landfall Data, and Jason just gave you the tip. Trust me, the tip of the iceberg of what these guys can do. So really reach out to them. They're here the whole day, and they'll be at the reception tonight, of course.
Thank you guys
Thank you,
very much.
Jason.
Good work, guys.